Who should file a tax return? Every taxpayer fits into one of two categories: dependent, non-dependent. Most taxpayers are non-dependents because they cannot be classified as a dependent on another taxpayer's return. For instance, let's imagine a husband and a wife who have 2 children under 10 years old. In virtually every case, you'll find that the husband and wife will file one return jointly as non-dependents while listing their young children as dependents. A chart in your workbook provides the gross income filing requirements for non-dependents. The requirements for filing a tax return vary depending on the marital status, age, and gross income of taxpayers and their dependents. In addition, you should file if the taxpayer can get a refund, even though his income is below the minimum required on the chart. Preparing a client's return might also be advantageous if he qualifies for the Earned Income Credit. Marital status is important to understand because it impacts a number of different tax considerations. As a professional tax preparer, you need only rely on what your clients present to you. In other words, there's no need for you to examine a marriage license once a client tells you he's married. Age is also a factor to consider when determining whether or not your client has to file a return. It can establish whether a person is a dependent or non-dependent and how much gross income is needed before a return is required. Although we'll speak of dependents in much more detail later, it's important to note that the presence of dependents can possibly qualify the taxpayer to use the head of household filing status, which will determine the amount of gross income required to file. Marital status, age, and the presence of dependents jointly determine the amount of gross income required before a person has to file a return. If your client is single, the gross income requirements are different than if your client is married. If the gross income of the taxpayer is less than the amount shown in the gross income column of the chart in your workbook, then he or she may not be required to prepare a return. Dependents also have filing requirements. Generally speaking, if a taxpayer's child is under age 19 or is a full-time student and earns less than the personal exemption, they most likely don't need to file a tax return. We'll talk later about what qualifies a person as a dependent. But to determine if they need to fill out a tax form, you'll want to refer to the chart in your workbook. I have found the most common reason for preparing a dependent's tax return is to receive taxes that were withheld from his paycheck. For instance, my son was a high school student. His gross income was less than what was required to file, but his employer had withheld federal income taxes from his paycheck. So although his income placed him well below the threshold, he had to file a tax return to receive a tax refund. There are additional reasons that a taxpayer must file, although they're relatively infrequent. The most common of these is if he owes special taxes, such as Social Security or Medicare tax on tips that were not reported to his employer. If you would like, pause the program for a minute or two and look over the gross income filing requirements table to become familiar with it, and then restart the program. Incidentally, the amounts change annually, but are readily available from the IRS or your software provider.